Welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark, the professional webinar series that offers clinical and personal perspectives on issues that are common, but often not talked about. Here is today's Collegial Conversation.
Thank you for joining a Collegial Conversation with Diana Clark. Joining us today is Gabrielle Loomis-Annette. Gabrielle is an advanced alcohol and drug counselor and licensed professional clinical counselor that is EMDR trained and a certified clinical trauma professional. Gabrielle Loomis-Annette has worked in the field for more than 12 years in a variety of settings, including residential, outpatient, private practice, and telehealth settings. Today, Diana and Gabrielle will be discussing the correlation between trauma and substance use disorders. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am now going to pass the conversation to Diana.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome, Gabrielle. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk to us. Let's start with the basic. Trauma. What are we defining as trauma? How does that impact us as humans? And then we can tie it to the substance use disorders. How's that?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And I appreciate the invitation to have these kinds of conversations. I always are, super stimulating for me as well. So I appreciate the opportunity. So, I think for me, trauma is the really large umbrella. And it encompasses things that we all typically think of as traumatic, something like being in combat or, a natural disaster, losing somebody that you love or you're close to. But I also, again, looking at the umbrella, also look at what we kind of call little t traumas or traumas that maybe we don't think of as being a traumatic experience. However, when we look at how our brain and bodies respond or react to the event, if they are reacting in traumatic stress response, then that's a trauma. And, one of the things that I do in working with clients is not only kind of assess their life experience around, what traumatic events or experiences they may have had, but there's a particular assessment that I use that's called the trauma symptom inventory assessment. It doesn't ask you about any experience. It's not your life events checklist. It is over 120 questions that help identify if you are in a traumatic stress reaction. That's how we know there's trauma.
And that would be helpful. I mean, for some of the people I have known, let's say they didn't know they didn't see the burglary, they didn't see the robbers, but they saw the windows were open, they saw all their stuff gone. They knew it, but they didn't have a memory or a particular event. They just had the fallout from it.
Exactly. And so many of my clients are like, right, I don't really think I have trauma. I don't like that word. Like it makes me think of veterans and I don't feel. But then when we do this deeper dive and exploration of what's happening for them, they're absolutely in a traumatic stress response in certain situations that are triggering something. And that may be something that they didn't think was traumatic or something that maybe they witnessed as opposed to experiencing firsthand. All of that can create a traumatic stress response, right? And the goal of trauma therapy is to get us out of that response. We're never going to change what happened, right? But if we can process and resolve what happened, if we can move it in the brain, then we don't react in traumatic stress. And for some people, traumatic stress may be, a high startle response. For some people, it may be that when people get too close, they push them away. For some people, it may be problem sleeping or, having bad dreams. Like I said, that one questionnaire is over 120 questions that are all symptoms of traumatic stress. So every person's different. What's happening for them is different. But if we can identify, the situations, the triggers, what kind of stress response they're in, then we can help them get out of that.
So you mentioned, and I'm fascinated by this, the idea that we can move certain memories in the brain to different locations in the brain that are probably less reactive.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that's the goal.
Yes.
How do we do that?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to do that. And when I was first trained, I learned as a trauma specialist, I learned a handful of kind of reprocessing techniques. And so there's a lot of ways to do that. I will say now, being EMDR trained, and actually I'm just waiting for my certification to come. So I'll be EMDR certified here shortly. It is probably the most effective tool that I typically use. And I think the vast majority of people that I work with can tolerate it well. So it's a great tool and a great technique, but the premise of EMDR and the premise of reprocessing memories and moving them is in the brain is that, which I think you'll find fascinating, I know I do, is if you create a separate experience like tapping or the eye movements with EMDR, if you give your memory or you give your brain something to focus on while you're processing the memory, that's what moves it. So because what happened, what in the original trauma is we were so 100% of our brain was in this negative experience. And so how we reprocess is we keep some of it in the here and now where we're safe. And then we just go back and process it. And that is what actually, it's a little bit more complex, but that's like the simple version of how we move things in the brain.
So I read an article, I haven't been able to find it since many years ago. Doesn't mean it didn't exist. I'm sure I didn't make it up, but they were talking about the utilization of the game Tetris on a Game Boy during
Oh my gosh.
flash.
Wow.
And it made sense. It was the same
Yeah.
kind of eye movement that happens
Yes.
when you're doing EMDR.
Yeah.
That was proven to be effective for dislodging, I think was the language they used.
That's so great. And it's like, all of this is an evolution, right? Like we've had exposure therapy for a long time, but really what EMDR and, I just think is done so well because there's so much research behind it is brought us forward in the last 20 plus years to say, you can do the exposure therapy, but you have to couple that with something. And, neuro-linguistic programming knew about the eye movements a long time ago. If you partner it with something, tapping is another thing you can partner it with. If you do the exposure therapy while you're doing that secondary kind of technique, it's really, really effective.
So the idea of just reliving the experience without the interruption, so to speak, or the other grounding experience or other neuro experience may not be healthy these
No,
days.
because you're just reliving the trauma then.
Right.
You're
You're
not
getting that
processing.
neural pathway.
Yeah, because the key is when you're reprocessing it, we have to stay regulated. The minute we go back to a traumatic stress response, the fight, flight, or freeze, we're not processing anything. We're just reliving a traumatic experience. And so that's what coupling it with the other kind of, stimulation or techniques. And we actually even know that bilateral is even more effective, which is what EMDR does, is what helps us keep us in a kind of a window where we don't go to the fight, flight, or freeze, right?
Right.
And that allows us to actually process.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So let's move from trauma to coping strategy that
Yeah.
isn't therapeutic. And I guess what we're really talking about are other behaviors that numb pain, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's, always been kind of my, I guess, take on it, as well as, that was reinforced for me in terms of education and training, is like substance use is a coping mechanism.
Correct.
Just like watching TV can be an overeating or shopping or gambling or you name it, right? So I definitely, come from that needs-based model that while, substance use is problematic and can have, life or death consequences, we also need to understand what it's doing for somebody and address that simultaneously. Because, my early experiences, right out of school, I've worked at probably 10 or so treatment centers over the years. And there was some ones that I worked at really early on that there was no trauma therapy. There was no kind of understanding of the bigger picture, or the belief was, we need to get, somebody abstinent. We need to stop the substance use, and then all that can be dealt with down the road. Well, when somebody stops using a substance and their untreated PTSD becomes, highly elevated, and they're experiencing symptoms that are, off the charts, no one can not use in that scenario, right? So
it's like we kicked out the crutch of coping.
Exactly.
Without a replacement.
Exactly. And I really believe that is, among one of the top reasons why, a lot of people have felt unsuccessful with treatment or have, relapsed. Because again, in that kind of model, that 28-day model, what I would see is that people would get worse with their symptomology the longer they were sober, and nothing was treating that or addressing that. Well, then that's just a matter of time before somebody is going to relapse because they need relief from untreated PTSD. So, that was really impactful for me. And, since then, in other places that I've worked, and including in my private practice, is, we treat trauma and addiction together from day one, because you can't treat them separately. And that's the only way people are going to have long-term success.
That's good to hear. That is really good to hear. So what are the ways you do tend to treat both simultaneously? You talked a minute about the EMDR, but in terms of treating the symptoms of substance use disorder, are you an advocate of harm reduction approaches? What is your go-to?
Yeah, I actually am an advocate of that. And that has, again, come about through my experience. I didn't start there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even broader than that, I'm an advocate of one size does not fit all. And
Right.
we, have definitely in the field, of addiction professionals, unfortunately, that's been the history of, this is the model, everybody needs to do it. And, we see success rates in some traditional treatment models less than 10%. And so obviously it's not working, right? And, so what I've come to see to be true is that medication-assisted treatment, harm reduction models can be not only helpful, but can really be the difference for some people. And everybody's case needs to be, evaluated thoroughly and understood, because there's so many dynamics, right? But the people that I've seen and worked with that have had the most success are including medication-assisted treatment for sure, whether they're doing an abstinence or a harm reduction model. And then some people, abstinence-based models work great, and some people, harm reduction models, work great. So yeah, I think it's, really having this individualized treatment plan for somebody.
I totally understand that we are founded as a company based on that as well.
Yeah.
And let's talk about the Sinclair Method for a minute. My understanding is that you are a practitioner that may use it as one of the modalities that you support. Let's talk about that. There's very few people who understand this method, and Europe is so far ahead of us in this. So let's talk about this. Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to. Yes, I'd love to talk about it, because again, it was so pivotal for me. I mean, there was a few years there where I thought, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I am, devoting my life and everything in me to help people, and they're not getting better. Like, there's something wrong with this formula, and I don't know how much longer I can do it. And of course, addiction is a high burnout, population, because it can be so severe. So when the Sinclair method was introduced to me, it came at a time that I was really receptive to it. And so I worked with an MD, a psychiatrist, and another clinician that had familiarity with it. And we together created a model of using the Sinclair method, with me being the counselor. And so the Sinclair method is a medication-assisted treatment. It falls under that umbrella. It's for alcohol use disorder only. But it is using one of the medications that is FDA approved for alcohol use in a very targeted way. We call it targeted naltrexone use. And so how most people use naltrexone is they take it once a day in the morning, and then they start drinking, maybe 6-8 hours later. At that point, what we know is that from the half-life of naltrexone is it's not really effective. And instead, what it's doing is it's blocking endorphins and good feeling hormones and neurotransmitters from things like coffee, exercise.
All day long, right?
Yeah, if people, work out in the morning, drink coffee, right? And so it's really not a good use of it. And so what they've done in Europe for, many, many years is you take the naltrexone an hour before you drink, somewhere between an hour to 2 hours before you intend to drink. And over a period of months, typically 6 to 12 months, it actually creates a pharmacological extinction, meaning that the naltrexone binds to the receptor sites in the brain. And through the process of taking it and then drinking, alcohol loses it no longer produces the dopamine hit, the dopamine flood.
The euphoria.
Exactly, the euphoria. And so when you continue to do it over that period of time, it is remarkable. I mean, people tell me they couldn't go 15 minutes without thinking about it, are like, I could take it or leave it. I could take it.
Doesn't do it anymore. Yeah.
Exactly, because it's all about the reward system in the brain, and that's not happening now at that same level. They're not getting the reward. And so it just becomes something that people can have a lot more choice around. And the great thing about the Sinclair method is that people can use it to return to manage drinking, or they can use it to get to abstinence.
Mm-hmm.
When people do the Sinclair method to get to abstinence, what I have found is that they are able to maintain that abstinence because
the brain.
Yeah, they've got the pharmacological extinction. And then they just get to a point where they're like, oh, it just makes me sleepy. It interrupts my sleep, and they're like, I'll do it on special occasions, but I really don't need to drink. And here they find themselves at their goal of abstinence that they tried for years to get to and just kept relapsing over and over. So it's as you can tell, I'm very passionate about it. It's a great tool.
Well, I appreciate your enthusiasm. It is a hopeful message. Is there anything else you would like our audience to know today?
I think if they have interest in the Sinclair method, I just really encourage clinicians, if that's in your, your field, to really check it out. The C3 Foundation is a foundation that was created by Claudia Christian. And she's really kind of the leading voice and advocate for the Sinclair method. Her website has great information. Lots of resources. There's even a section about resources for doctors. And I'll just share my experience with it is I've introduced this to doctors who are like ready to pull their hair out. They don't know what to do. They have so many clients coming, struggling, with over drinking. So I just encourage people to check it out. Feel free to reach out to me or, the C3 Foundation. It's important for all of us to have the tools, to treat everybody individually. And a lot of people don't know about this. So I encourage them to check it out.
Well, thank you for exploring it with us and elucidating a concept I had some understanding of, but it's wonderful to hear more about it. And thank you for being such an engaging guest.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining this webinar. Tune in to more webinars and sign up for our newsletter at o'connorpg.com.